when you're revising for the power and conflict poems, it's really helpful to sort of group them into little clusters, so that when you're given a theme on the exam paper, you know already what kind of poems that one links to quite naturally. So we've looked at a kind of a war cluster where you've got poppies and war photographer and exposure and bayonet charge, all of which deal with experiences of war. And then we've started to have a look at a little cluster which I think are linked together by abuses of power, where there's some form of injustice or whereby there's somebody who's been corrupted by power. So we've had a look at Ozymandias, and Ozymandias in his position as king abused his authority and became a tyrant. I've also mentioned the idea of the abuse of power in terms of Charge of the Light Brigade, because on the one hand it's a poem about the heroism and glory of war in terms of all of these soldiers sort of going off and dying for out of their kind of patriotic sense of loyalty. However, I think that maybe the use of rhythm and rhyme and the unstoppability of that poem means that it really is criticising the people who went to send them, the someone who had blundered as well. So that can be seen as a critique of authority as well. The poem that we're looking at today, London, definitely criticises authority. It's showing how power has been abused, and we'll also have a look at My Last Duchess as well as being a poem that shows somebody who becomes tyrannical and kind of abusive with their power. Today's poem, London, is by William Blake, and rather than looking at war, we're going to look at kind of a less structured conflict, a less official conflict, something which we call revolution. This poem is much more about revolution than it is necessarily about an organised war. So, as per normal, we'll start off by reading the poem, and then we'll go through and analyse it in as much detail as possible. So at this point you should have your anthology out in front of you, ready to highlight or underline anything that you think is important, and to make sure that you are getting to grips with the language that is being used. London by William Blake. I wander through each charted street near where the charted Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every ban, the mind-forged manacles I hear. How the chimney sweepers cry every blackening church appalls, and the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. But most through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear, and blights with plagues the marriage hearse. Before we continue with my analysis, this is your opportunity to go away and annotate it for what your ideas are for the poem. So this is a good place to pause the video, and I'm just going to show you some techniques that you can start to look out for, as well as annotating for the ideas. And then once you've had a look for yourself, continue with the video and listen to my analysis of it. So those are the techniques that you might want to look out for. Okay. I'm going to start off with the very first stanza. I wander through each charted street near where the charted Thames does flow. Now, that first couplet sets up an image of the speaker walking through London. The idea of them wandering through the streets is a very sort of, it seems like such a relaxed verb, I wander. However, if we think about wander as a homophone with two meanings, I wander means like I am physically wandering through somewhere, but also means I wonder like I'm questioning something. And the idea of questioning something is really important in terms of rebellion, because you're questioning the status quo, you're questioning the authority. So it begins with a double meaning. the idea of wandering in the sense of movement is very fluid and very relaxed, which is juxtaposed with that word charted. Charted is just an archaic, like an old-fashioned word which means kind of regulated and structured. So the streets are organised and they're established. And that word charted is repeated to describe the river. And it's really odd seeing that word using to describe to describe something which is naturally very flowing and very free with its movement. It suggests that something is being perhaps unnaturally controlled here. And that theme of control is something that we'll return to again and again with this poem. Who is doing the controlling? Who is being the controlled? And how is the structure showing control as well? End of that stanza. And mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. So if we read the full stanza, you can hear that there's a very strict rhythm and rhyme, and that rhythm and rhyme comes from something that Blake does with a lot of his poems, which is kind of to mimic a nursery rhyme feeling. Blake is very concerned with innocence and experience. So the structure of the poem suggests innocence. On the surface, it seems to be just kind of telling this tale. I wander through each charted street. But actually what Blake does by using such an innocent structure, such a childlike structure, is he addresses very, very serious things, and he shows how innocence is being lost. And not just lost, but kind of taken from the people who are vulnerable. So we've got a very strict rhythm. I wander through each charted street. So if you count the syllables, I wander through each charted street. So that's 8 syllables. Near where the charted Thames does flow, 8 syllables again. And if you have 8 syllables per line, and you can hear the alternating stresses on the words, that means that there are 4 stress syllables per line, which gives us iambic tetrameter. So iambic tetrameter is the name that we give it when there are 4 stress syllables, and it's really commonly found in nursery rhymes. So I'm just going to write that down for you so that you know how to spell it. Iambic tetrameter. That's the kind of thing which is trickier to remember, so don't get caught up in remembering that terminology if you find it kind of awkward or difficult to talk about. All you need to say is it has a very, very strict rhythm and rhyme. The end of that first stanza, and mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. You've got that word mark repeated 3 times. And the first time that it's used, it's saying I mark it, like I see it, I'm noticing it. So the first use of mark means I'm noticing this. I mark in every face I meet. And then the second time the word mark is used, it means that they can see like damage, or they can see signs of something, marks of weakness, marks of woe. There are signs of weakness and woe. And just to back up that feeling of a nursery rhyme, you can see the alliteration and the repetition being used here. Marks of weakness, marks of woe. You've got the repeated plosive M sound, mark, meet, marks, marks, and you've also got the repetition, the alliteration of weakness and woe. So it begins with this juxtaposition between flowing movements, wandering and flowing, and then you have the more ominous foreshadowing of control through the charted streets and the charted Thames, but it's the end of the first stanza where we really see that critique of authority coming through. So that theme of the critique of authority. Because what the speaker is seeing is he's seeing an unhappy place. This is not a happy city. Not only is it not happy, but it's a very powerful statement. It's saying that something's wrong here. And then he goes on to explain what the marks of weakness and woe are. So he can hear in every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every band. So it's all to do with this kind of cacophony of sound. Cacophony means sort of like a clamouring, oppressive sound. There's a cacophony of cries, and that word cry obviously can refer to being upset, but it also can be a shout, like a call to arms. I'm crying out for people to come together and fight. So the men are crying, And that's juxtaposition, the cry of every man. It makes it seem like the shout of every man, but also that doesn't kind of fit in with masculine stereotypes. And it's nice to kind of think about masculine stereotypes because we've seen that in previous poems as well. So in every cry of every man, also that word man perhaps here is not being used just specifically to mean male man, but humankind, in the cry of everybody in this city. And then repetition in every infant's cry of fear. So we've got that image of man, which is strong and authoritative, but then we've got infants, which are weak and completely innocent, so more juxtaposition here. And those infants are afraid, which once again is really shocking for us. We've got this kind of nursery rhyme style poem, and yet we've got infants crying. There's something really untoward happening here. In every voice, in every ban, the mind-forged manacles I hear. So a ban is like a think about banner. Think about like a declaration of something. So in everything in the city, he can hear these mind-forged manacles, and that mind-forged manacles image is a really, really helpful one for you to memorise. It's really easy to remember because of that alliterative mind and manacles, and it's a really, really interesting image. So mind forged, so forged means created, so the mind is creating manacles, and manacles means kind of like restraints or chains. So what Blake is suggesting is that the people in the city have their minds chained in some way. So these people are essentially being, for want of a better word, kind of brainwashed or kind of manipulated into believing something. So these people are suffering because of the things that they're being forced to think. Which is a really interesting thing, because in a lot of the other poems that we've seen, it's to do with kind of physical suffering. Here there is physical suffering in the poem, but it's all because of those mind-forged manacles, because they've been, it's their beliefs and the values that they've been taught in society which are damaging them. The next stanza, how the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls. So chimney sweepers here are sort of, you know, the sort of lowest in society, that kind of working class who would have been poor and living in poverty in London at this time. So and often as well they would have been children, so there's child labour at this time, so it gives us that image of a child suffering again, how the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls. Now the blackening church is one of the key images here that helps us to unlock exactly what authority or what establishment it is that Blake is criticising. So there's a real challenge to the establishment in this poem, and the church is an establishment. It's something which gives people beliefs. So that helps us to unlock that mind-forged manacles image, that the church are giving people this kind of society and culture in which they're not allowed to think freely. And we can tell that it's a critique of the church because of that pre-modifying adjective, blackening. So pre-modifying just means it comes before the noun. And we know it's an adjective because it's describing it, it's giving us the colour. But it's also not just telling us the colour, it's suggesting that it's blackening, that it's in some way becoming kind of corrupt, that it's blackening in the sense of sinfulness or that kind of dark influence that it's having on society. That actually, whilst religion is something that we see as perhaps, you know, it should give people hope and faith, actually here it's saying that it's being used as a tool to oppress the lower classes. We can see that in the end of this stanza as well, that it's not just the church. So, and that hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. The palace is the other establishment that we can see in the poem. And the palace is a really interesting symbol because it links to the French Revolution, which Blake may have been influenced by. So at this time, people in France were questioning the aristocracy. They were questioning the monarchy and anybody who had inherited wealth and power. And the lower classes in France were suffering so much that they began a revolution against the monarchy. So the idea of blood down palace walls, that idea of the people who've been oppressed and powerless, their blood is staining the palace walls, is suggesting that the palace is responsible for the suffering of the people, that all of the money and all of the power is being kept inside the palace, and that everybody else, because of that, doesn't have money and doesn't have power. So the hapless soldier represents the way that the state is kind of abusing its responsibility to its people. And even soldiers, the people who should be fighting for the country, they're sighing because of their suffering. And then we get to the final stanza, but most through midnight streets I hear. So we've got this cumulative effect in the poem. The structure builds and builds and builds up until this final stanza where the poet gives us a new idea. But most. But most through midnight streets I hear. So midnight streets, interesting adjective there again, this idea that the streets are dark and perhaps dangerous. I hear how the youthful harlots curse. So harlot is just slang for a prostitute. And once again we've got that juxtaposition, the idea of a youthful harlot. That word harlot is associated with sexual exploitation. So the idea that they're youthful is really distressing. The youthful harlots curse, and by curse it means swearing or how they are cursed, how they're being exploited. But if you think of it as curse as in swearing, the harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear. So we have this image of prostitutes shouting and swearing down the streets, and that's the first thing that newborn babies hear. So it's a really kind of grotesque image. And that word grotesque is quite useful for this poem because it describes how kind of disgusted William Blake was with the way that people were suffering in London. So it blasts, a really aggressive verb there. It's blasting the newborn infants and they're crying. And how it blights with plagues the marriage hearse. So that final image suggests that everything that's good about life is being destroyed by these mind-forged manacles. Plagues is a really biblical word, and it suggests that everything is being destroyed. And the marriage hearse oxymoron is really interesting because we've got this, marriage is meant to be a celebration of life and love, and yet it's that idea that all of that is dying. You've got the misery connoted by the idea of a hearse, which is a vehicle used to carry bodies to a funeral. So that's an overview of the imagery in the poem, and this is a really, really helpful poem to know well because of how much you can say a lot about a little. A lot of the images that Blake gives us, you can say 2 or 3 things about. And a lot of the themes that it uses in terms of stolen innocence is really interesting because we've seen that theme of innocence in the other poems that we've looked at. And it links really nicely with poems like Ozymandias, where you have that idea of somebody in a position of authority allowing other people to suffer. So a really good one to get some quotations written down so that you can memorise them.